Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Nightlight. This is going to be a fun show tonight because on top of the fact that I think the author that we're interviewing is spectacular, it's unashamedly one of my favorite other authors, and that's Theodor Geisel, who became Dr. Seuss. We're going to be talking about becoming Dr. Seuss tonight, and he was a definitive, fascinating, all-reaching, amazing character in and of himself. He is a classic American icon, whimsical and wonderful. His work has defined our childhoods and the childhoods of our own children. I can absolutely agree with that statement wholeheartedly. I think I became more of a fan ultimately because I keep finding new messages in all of his stories. The silly, simple rhymes are bottomless wells of magic, and his illustrations timeless favorites because, quite simply, he makes us laugh. The Grinch, the Cat in the Hat, Horton, and so many more are his troupe of beloved and uniquely Seussian creations. Theodor Geisel, I don't know if that's really French or if it's Geisel. Well, I'll have to ask. However, he had a second, more radical side. It is there that the allure and fascination of his Dr. Seuss alter ego begins. He had a successful career as an advertising man and then as a political cartoonist, and his personal convictions appeared not always subtly throughout his books. Remember the environmentalist of the Lorax. Geisel was a complicated man on an important mission. He introduced generations to the wonders of reading while teaching young people about empathy and how to treat others well. He agonized over word choices and rhymes, probably drove people crazy with that, touching up drawings, and sometimes for years he upheld a rigorous standard of perfection for his work. He took his responsibility as a writer for children seriously, talking down to no reader, no matter how small, and with whimsical classics like Green Eggs and Ham and One Fish, Two Fish, Red Fish, Blue Fish, he taught and delighted them while they learned. Suddenly, reading became fun. Coming right off the heels of George Lucas and best-selling Jim Henson, which we did a few months ago, Brian is quickly developing a reputation as a master biographer of the creative geniuses of our times. I can't wait to hear what's next. Certainly, we're going to go into the George Lucas book at some point in time within the next year, so keep posted and stay tuned because that's coming up probably not shortly, but sometime next year. So welcome to the show, Brian. I'm so glad we finally got this one in.
Hi, Barbara. Good evening.
Good. It's a great evening. This Dr. Seuss was, I think I found myself sitting in the children's department of Barron's and other bookstores reading the Dr. Seuss books without my child there. It was such an amazing, uplifting book to read because I loved the whimsicalness and the amazing ways that he twisted rhymes that had no reason that became reason. And my son had a full library that I continued to enjoy long after he was in college. And you know, he one day sat down and took a look, and he said, "Are you going backwards or what?" I said, "No, I'm waiting for grandchildren." So, you know, I said, "I'm armed and ready," and I'm glad I did because they are treasured books. And I mean, when you were a child, did you grow up on them, or were you out of sync with his time frame?
No, and it wasn't a matter of being out of sync with him. It was one of those, you know, so many people I know learned how to read using Dr. Seuss books. I wasn't one of them. I learned how to read off of, you know, my brother and I, reprints of Mad Magazine and things like that. Those are kind of what was around that I learned to read off of. To me, Dr. Seuss was always the dentist office book. And I always really actually looked forward, that was, I guess, one way to get me to go to the dentist, to reading Dr. Seuss books. And to me, some of the first of his books I fell in love with were, you know, Bartholomew Cubben's The 500 Hats. Some of that stuff that wasn't really the what we think of as the sort of the pure, the real Dr. Seuss. It was some of that, what I now know is some of his really early stuff. So I came to him, my relationship with him was different than it was with a subject like Jim Henson, for example, who Jim Henson was somebody I was aware of from the time I was, 2 years old. I was sort of Sesame Street Generation 1.0. Seuss was always around, but, it wasn't one of these books that was, one of these characters that was formative in my life the way Henson or maybe even Lucas was. So what I really loved about writing this book is I was kind of learning about him as I went along, and I'm sort of and I'm conveying what I find fascinating about him to the reader almost in real time, if that makes sense. So it was a little bit of a different relationship with my subject than I ever had before, which made it a really different and interesting and kind of fun book. Well, all of my subjects have been fun, fortunately, but it was a different book for me to write because of that relationship I had with Seuss. That was not quite the formative relationship a lot of other people have with him.
Well, it was interesting because I have a big website and I write a lot of stuff for it. And one of my favorite articles was, "Are you Horton or are you the Who?" And and I actually referred people back to reading the book to see if you were someone who was screaming to be recognized, or were you someone that was hearing a signal that came from somewhere that nobody else heard. And
interesting.
It was an amazing topic to write on, and I got so many people who wrote me back and said, I never looked at the Dr. Seuss books as a moral lesson or an ethical lesson. And after my Are You Horton or the Who, people went back and they started to read the books and they started to see the messages, like 30, 40, 50 years later, that what it taught you. And it was amazing. I think in many ways he didn't even realize how deep his gift and his talent went, in that he was putting forth philosophy that you have to be older and wiser to grab onto, but once you see the philosophy, and realize that it's been taught to the children, and that it's in some way, shape, or form he has planted a seed of understanding of a purity of spirit that is just unbelievable. I think everybody should go back and read all the books again and find the messages that are in there.
Well, and what's interesting about Seuss is he often, for most of his life, said that his books were not deliberately messagey, but that you can find messages in them, and he loved that the message was whatever you were looking for. Sometimes that came back to bite him, sometimes it didn't. But, for example, Horton Here's a Who, he has often said that reflects the power of a single voter, for example, because what puts them over the top, and when all the Who start shouting, is the very last one climbs up on top and says, "Yeah!" And Seuss always said later on, raise your voice and let your yop be heard. And he compared that to the power of voting, for example. But the other thing in Horton Hears a Who is that you can be read very deliberately, and I think there's some of this intentionally from Seuss, as sort of his love letter to the people of Japan after World War II, after we had bombed them. And in that book, if you notice the dedication in that book, and I'm not going to even attempt to say the name, but he dedicated that to the gentleman, it was a professor who escorted him around Japan and was his translator. And a lot of people read that book as Seuss saying, we know something terrible happened to you. We see you, we hear you, we acknowledge you. And so that book can also be read as sort of Seuss's love letter to the Japanese people. Seuss later in his life became a real sort of Japanophile. Took vacation or trips over there and was an enormous fan of the Japanese people, Japanese art, Japanese culture. So you can definitely read Horton Hears a Who that way as well. But any other way you wanted to read stuff, again, Seuss often said, I'm not putting a message in there. If you saw a message, that's yours to get. The one deliberate message he always did have that he would fess up to in his lifetime was Yertle the Turtle was Adolf Hitler. The Lorax was his deliberately preachy book, as he often said. That was his environmental book. And the Grinch was sort of his own statement on consumerism, which he totally admitted to being part of. He had been an ad man for years. Part of his job was to tell you Christmas came from a store. And in the Grinch, you see sort of Seuss working that out. So.
Yeah, I can remember sitting reading one of the books to my son, and my mother sticking her head in the room and saying, he's been asleep for the last half hour. I said, yeah, but I haven't finished the book yet. So.
Yeah. I mean, the great thing about, writing about Seuss is I got to go back and revisit all the books that I had read and so many more that I had never even heard of. When I started this project, and had you asked me to write down Dr. Seuss books, I could probably have given you the greatest hits. I might not have been able to get past 10 maybe, and not really appreciating that he wrote more than 60. Wow. For a period of 1930 on through the 1990s. So he's got an awful lot of books, and so that was the really fun part for me, was getting to go back and read the ones I remembered. Like I said, Bartholomew Cubbins, and it's sort of the greatest hits. But a lot of these other little, these that I'd never heard of. If I Ran the Zoo, and If I Ran the Circus, and Happy Birthday to You, and sort of these middle tier books that he wrote in the 50s before he really, and we'll talk about this, before he really became Dr. Seuss. Was just sort of still putting them out every once in a while. They're some really beautiful books. Some of them have gotten him in trouble since then. But they're really lovely books, and some of those from that period I think are some of his best rhymes, some of his bounciest rhymes. He's a real tour de force, and you can really see him as you're reading his work, figuring things out, which is one of the things I thought was so interesting. And again, that was why I called that book Becoming Dr. Seuss, because again, not really knowing that much about him, it was fascinating to watch him have several careers before he finally settles into what we now think of and know of as Dr. Seuss.
Yeah, he came. As I recall, it almost started in college to a degree, didn't it?
He was a mediocre student. He was about a 2.5 GPA student at Dartmouth, and ended up getting a scholarship. Well, he didn't get a scholarship. He made up a story that he got one, and so he didn't want to go public with it. His father paid for him to go to Oxford. And when he was at Oxford, he was much more interested in drawing in his notebooks than he was in taking notes in them. One of my favorite documents in the Seuss library in California is his Oxford journal is there. And you open it, and you can see he's taking really diligent notes in the first couple of pages, and then the drawings start showing up in the margins, and as you keep turning pages, the drawings get larger and larger and larger, and eventually there's no writing left on the page. And that was when another young American woman who was attending classes over there said, that's what you should be doing. And that turned out to be Helen, who was his first wife. She's the one who said, somebody who draws crazy-looking animals like you should be doing that for a living. Now, Seuss had worked at the newspaper that it was called Jack-o'-lantern. It was sort of their version of the National Lampoon or the Harvard Lampoon. Most Ivy League colleges had a satirical newspaper or magazine at the time, and that was the Dartmouth version. And he was sort of like finding his way there. He wasn't really, there was no way he was coming out fully formed as Dr. Seuss, and he's still finding his way, finding the pseudonym. For example, he finally signs a drawing as Seuss when he's in college. He doesn't come up with Dr. Seuss until later. But he's sort of finding his way. But after he leaves college, he and Helen get married, and he moves to New York City and begins making a career. As hard as it is to believe, you could make a full-time career submitting cartoons to Life magazine and Vanity Fair. And, he ended up being sort of the regular cartoonist for a magazine called Judge. So did that for quite a while and sort of accidentally stumbled into becoming a really successful advertising man. When a cartoon of his that showed a knight laying in bed and there's this dragon sticking its head in the window, actually a terrible dragon. Seuss isn't very good at drawing dragons, but this dragon sticking his head in the window, and Seuss says, the knight says, "Drat it all, and here I just sprayed the place for Flip," which was a bug spray at the time, which had DDT in it. That was one of its big selling points. But the Flip people, which it actually came out of like Esso and Standard Oil, got wind of that cartoon. In fact, the wife of the man at the advertising firm, I think it was McCann Erickson, if you watched Mad Men, you should know that name. She came home and said, "I just saw the greatest ad for one of your clients here. You need to hire this guy to be your ad man for Flit." And so Seuss sort of backed into being hired to be the advertising man for Flit, which is a job he does, I want to say, for 17 or 20 years or something like that. And that was sort of his regular source of income, was becoming an advertising man. And kids' books was not anything he had this driving passion for. That was one of the things I found so interesting about Seuss is he's not one of these people who, early on says, "Oh, I really want to write books for kids." He ends up writing his first book for children, which is it ends up being the And to Think That I Saw on Mulberry Street, mainly because it's not prohibited by the contract he has with Standard Oil. In the contract he's got for his Flit campaign, there's a whole bunch of non-compete clauses. Like you can't write and do ads and drawing for other people. But there was a loophole in his contract that excluded children's books. So he gets into writing kids' books mainly because the money's on the table for that. Now, it turns out he's pretty good at it, but it wasn't one of these great callings that he kind of had, at least not early on. And again, that's when he sort of starts becoming Dr. Seuss. But a book like And to Think That I Saw on Mulberry Street was inspired by he and his wife Helen were on a cruise, and they were listening to the sounds of the engine sort of turning over with this regular rhythm, and that became the rhythm he adopted. As I found out, I think it's called anapestic iambic anapest, I think is the formal name for that rhyme scheme. That becomes And to Think That I Saw on Mulberry Street, a book that was rejected something like 27 times, although Seuss, who never let the truth get in the way of a good story, it was rejected 27 times, 55 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. Every time he told the story, it got more and more. About 27 times until it finally found a home. And so that was Seuss's first book. But again, not the result of any great burning need to write books for young kids. That comes later.
Well, don't you think it seems that people who have a calling, often don't hear it until they fall into it?
Well, that's exactly right, and I think that's exactly what happened with Seuss. I'll jump over a little bit of his career because he ends up with a fascinating career as an editorial cartoonist for a little while. But after he comes out of the military, he had been sort of wooed by Hollywood. He was a really good movie writer when he was in the Army. He did a lot of training films, and so Hollywood sort of came calling. And he was really unhappy with that. But because he had written a number of children's books, and at that point in his career, I think he'd written 6 or 7, not very many, he gets asked to teach a course on writing books for children at the University of Utah in 1949, I think it is. And it's a really hugely important moment, not just for Seuss, but for children's books in general, because, and this was another document that I laid hands on at the Seuss archives, because it's in his handwriting. It's on yellow pads in his penciled writing. And it's him putting down on paper for the very first time ever why he thinks kids deserve books of their own, why he thinks they deserve good books, and what is it that keeps children interested. And he acknowledges, for example, that comic books are your main competition. And, why do kids like comics? Because they're interesting, and they're fun, and they're fast, and they're colorful, and this is who you're competing with. And so if you're writing for kids, make your books interesting, make them colorful, make them fast. And he had learned a lot in the military doing training films with Frank Capra, believe it or not, was his commanding officer. And Capra's the one that sort of told him about when you're writing scripts. You know, he says, keep the plot moving forward. I'm going to underline in your script, like, what is plot and what is not. And Seuss learned about plot and how that's so important. So story is what gets kids. But it's a really important moment because it's Seuss, sort of convincing himself, talking to himself about how important it is for children to have books that they deserve, is the word he kept using. That you don't want to give children these terrible, boring books. He always called them the bunny books about cute little bunnies. No kid wants to read that. They want to read books that are fun and interesting and a little dangerous. So it's a really important moment in Seuss sort of figuring it out. And it's also a time in children's books. I think you had Eloise was starting to come out. So you had a couple of sort of character-driven, like Curious George had just come out. So you had some people that were starting to figure it out a little bit, but for the most part, children's books were very, I don't want to say preachy, but they were mostly about the moral, more about message than they were about entertainment. And Seuss just kept saying, there's nothing wrong with entertaining kids. Stop boring them. And that's the first real step in his career and in his own mindset as a writer for children.
Well, I just so did the artwork come first or the story? It had to be the artwork.
They sort of both come together, but he the story was usually what he came up with first, and then would start writing the rhyme. And Seuss had learned from the time he was in the military and working for Frank Capra. When Seuss was in the Army, he worked for the Signal Corps during World War II in the United States. He didn't ever go to Europe, at least not to fight. And his commanding officer was Frank Capra, and they were producing training films for soldiers who were, for the most part, a lot of them were illiterate. So you had to entertain them and train them, and a lot of the ways they did this was with cartoons, and they created a character called Private Snafu. And Seuss wrote a lot of these Private Snafu cartoons. And Capra's the one who taught him, like this, plot is what matters. But Capra, because he was a film director, taught him how to storyboard. And he also learned how to storyboard from Chuck Jones, who was an up-and-coming animator at Warner at that time. Later becomes the animator. Like, it's any Bugs Bunny cartoon you love probably had Chuck Jones' name on them later. What's Opera Doc and One Froggy Evening and all the huge ones. But he wasn't that Chuck Jones yet. But so Seuss learns how to storyboard. And that becomes really important to the way he worked. In his office, he lived in La Jolla, California, he actually had corkboard on the walls. And he would pin his pages up on the wall he would type out the rhyme and the story, and sometimes he would draw sort of rough draft sketches, and he would just walk around the room and stare at these pages. And part of what mattered was not just the sound of the words, but how did the words look on the page? For example, if the rhyme scheme was perfect, but you had two lines that were 2 inches long or 2.5 inches long, and the third line was 5 inches long, and then the last line was 2.5 inches long again, Seuss didn't like that. He didn't like the way that looked on the page. That line was too long. Even if it scanned perfectly fine and the rhyme was fine, he would go back and rewrite it because it just didn't look right even on the page. So he had this real need that had to be almost perfect. Like, it wasn't just the way the words sounded. It was the way they looked on the page, which seems a little crazy, but it really made him work to be sure that every word mattered, that there's not a word wasted. And that's one of the neat things about Seuss. If you're reading, and you know this, Barbara, from reading them out loud even to your kids, you never have to work to make the rhyme. You never have to say a word funny to make the rhyme work in Seuss. Like you never have to enunciate a 3-syllable word oddly. You never. If Seuss is going to use the word refrigerator, it's going to scan as refrigerator, not refrigerator. If that makes any sense. He just the words his words are pronounced naturally because he worked really hard at that. He didn't want you stumbling over a rhyme and ruining the rhyme because you were mispronouncing a normal word in a weird way to make the rhyme scheme work. So everything really mattered to Seuss, but he would have the art up on the wall, rough drafts, rough sketches of that. He was very particular about color. He would often take a colored pencil and break it and send it to the printing shop at Random House and say, match this color green, please, and make them go find it on their color wheel. So everything really really mattered. Everything really mattered to him, and I think that's one of the reasons his books are so good. Why they sort of transcend generations is because he puts so much work into them that makes them sort of timeless. And Seuss's art in itself is for the most part pretty timeless too, which is I think one of the reasons his work is still so popular. You can't place it in a time period. It doesn't really look like it belongs. It doesn't look like it belongs anywhere. It is timeless. You go back and look at something like Mulberry Street, which is clearly sort of taking place in the 1930s. And again, that's where Seuss started to get into trouble because he's got depictions of, Chinese people in that book that are not terribly sensitive by today's standards. But that's why if he gets away from drawing more realistic and drawing what we now call sort of Seussian creatures, that gives his work that real sense of it could be happening anywhere, anytime, any place.
Yeah, that's one of the. He often. I was amazed at the creativity inside of his head. It was just. It had to be amazing because it felt like almost it felt like he was constantly drawing and rhyming and immersing himself in another topic. It didn't feel like he really took any time off for anything. He had an amazing sense of humor and often, a little strange. And
Cocktail
he was
hour,
unique.
always cocktail hour.
Oh yeah.
Always cocktail hour.
No, it to me it was phenomenal, and the fact that he had a partner, a wife, for so very long that supported him totally, it was just amazing. And then
go ahead.
Then he grew out of her.
Well, and Helen, his first wife, was absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I mean, she's as strong a character in his story as anybody, I think.
Well, that's what amazed me. I mean, he was connected to her on so many different levels, and then suddenly that connection wasn't there anymore, and she didn't understand it either. But no. I think what got to me was when that connection was gone, so was he on an emotional level, and I don't think she ever understood, and I probably wouldn't have been able to either, just what happened. But he kind of switched horses. Yeah, I mean, he switched horses in the middle of the stream, which most people don't do. And when he did, there was not a bit of remorse, or it didn't appear that there was mourning of any sort. I'm sure there was to a degree, but he moved on, and it was almost like it's over and I have to move on, and he did. I mean, to the wife of a good friend. I mean,
that he and his wife had socialized with. Yeah. It's so interesting with three of my subjects, with Jim Henson, George Lucas, and Dr. Seuss. All three of them had these incredible partners in their life. These women who were brilliant, who supported them, who they all absolutely trusted. Like Helen, for example, was the one person who could tell Seuss no. She would be the one who would just call BS on him and say, this isn't working. She was one of the few people who could do that, who he would listen to. She would come out and say, you've drawn this wrong, or this is too big, or this is too small. And he might complain, but he would always know she was right. Jim Henson was kind of that way with Jane. He would check in with her immediately after he did the Tonight Show appearance. Was I okay? How did it look? George Lucas was like this with his wife, Marcia, who was a brilliant editor. She has the Academy Award. He doesn't, for editing Star Wars. And so all three of them had these brilliant wives who were, absolute creative partners, and who they all three lost either through intentional or benign neglect. I just think it's fascinating because all those women, from Marcia Lucas, from Helen Geisel to Jane Henson, all three of them are so important in the story of those characters. They were there from the beginning. They helped them start their companies. They encouraged them, inspired them. They supported them. And like I said, there were times it was intentional and times it was benign. But I just find it fascinating that that's a through line in those three stories.
Yeah, and to me, it was, especially with Helen. Helen, I felt for more than Henson's wife, because of course he kept that contact throughout his life, even though they weren't married anymore. I mean,
right.
she was always the one he went back to check in with, and when he became very ill, she was right there. So, that one I could understand, and I felt okay with, but with Giselle, I mean, come on.
Well, the really horrifying part of the story with he and Helen is, Helen had health issues, and he had nursed her through several long-term illnesses. She had polio as a child, and so, she always seemed to have long-term health issues. And he, to his credit, early on was hugely supportive, and she always talked about what an angel he was. But as time went on and she, came more and more incapacitated, I think, you saw him losing, I don't know if it was losing interest necessarily, but, that was when his attention got pulled by Audrey. But the really heartbreaking part of that story is that she takes her own life and leaves just a really heartbreaking note behind for that. So I think that's what makes her story truly devastating. I don't know how much longer she would have, how long she would have lived had she not done that. But, she in her letter, she just says, we're not going to ruin your reputation. I mean, she's thinking of him till the very end. Seuss's first biographer actually called that note like her last great gift to him, which I think is a little dark and a little weird, but I mean, it's a heartbreaking moment in his story. And like you said, I mean, he almost rebounds too quickly. I think he was married to Audrey within 6 months or something like that, as long as it took for her to go to Reno and get the divorce, because she was married as well. It's the one portion of the story. And again, I didn't know that when I started researching him, but it is that moment that sort of, hits you in the face as you're reading along. Just not an expected part of the story. Now, I see people on social media telling just horrible stories about, their relationship, how Steve was actually the one that wrote and drew all the stories, and he stole her work, and none of that is true. Like, he can behave badly without stealing any of her artwork. She did not do the writing and the drawing. That was all Seuss.
No, I just think there was, when I hit that part of the book, it was, oh no, she didn't.
Yeah, it's a real tone shift, isn't it?
Well, it is, and it was sort of like I understood why she did what she did. She just, I understand why she did it, and maybe he did too. But I mean, he blatantly went after his friend's wife, and it wasn't oh, we fell into each other because of my loss. Hell no, you created the loss. And
right,
and
it was already going on. That's right.
And but and they had absolutely I do believe they felt they belonged together, and they probably did. So that I understand it. I understand that sometimes absolute genius does things that don't fit in with society. That's not an excuse. That's just an explanation. And it just, to me, I know she was good for him and with him, and she was supportive of him, and she was there till the end and all of that. But it just, I didn't like her.
Yeah, and she was she had a very different role than Helen had. She stayed out of his work. She let him take care of the work, and she took care of the social side, which was always pretty important to Seuss. Throughout his life, during Prohibition, he and Helen, they went out to bars every night during Prohibition. They were a very social couple. And Audrey kind of kept that up when they were together. She would throw these big elaborate parties at the house, and they had these amazing guest lists. One of their neighbors right down the hill from where they live in La Jolla was Jonas Salk. They had this really interesting guest list and this interesting circle of friends that she sort of kept everything going. But, she was apparently the life of the party, and he adored her two children. Now, Seuss and Helen, Helen was unable to have children, so they didn't have children of their own. And Seuss always said, you have them, I'll entertain them. But he had to sort of learn to be a parent to Audrey's two daughters, who were teenagers when he came along. But that was the first time he actually had to think like a parent, which he'd never actually done before.
Well, it did fill a void in his concept of life as we know it, too. So, and he was really good with them. I mean, he put the work in.
Yeah.
And I really, his artwork fascinated me. I'm not an artist by any means. I mean, I can doodle a good square, and that's about it. But what flowed out of him automatically, when he let his mind loose to be creative, was just amazing. And you wonder, where does that come from?
Yeah, and it's a style that looks easy to imitate, and it's not. And there's little things in his art that you don't realize is what makes it look Seussian. For example, everybody has eyelashes. If you look at it, they all have eyelashes on it, and they have these really wide, expressive eyes. And there's something about that style that if you try to, you can copy it, but you can't mimic it. If that makes sense. Because there's just something about the way his characters, the way gravity works on his characters. If you look at a book like Cat in the Hat, open that book up and find any time the cat's feet are on the ground. They're on the ground at the end when he's kind of sad, but for the most part, the cat is constantly in motion. You go page to page, and like his legs are rubbery. I mean, he's got a physics to him, but it's gravity works different on the cat. His feet aren't on the ground; they're never touching the ground. His legs are bent. His mouth is always open. I mean, he's got this motion to him constantly, and I think that's one of the things that keeps kids turning the pages in that book, because the cat is always constantly moving forward, and you want to see where he's going to go with that book. But let me talk at this point, because the Cat in the Hat's a good place to bring this up. So I've talked a little bit about some of his other careers, and the moment I think he really becomes what we think of as Dr. Seuss, the one who's writing the great books for children. It happens that early in his career he's writing books that children love, but he gets to a point in his life when he starts deliberately writing books that have sort of a pedagogy behind them, that not only are they fun to read, but they help you learn to read. And that comes out of, a Life magazine article written by John Hersey. He was sort of a Nobel Prize-winning novelist. And he did an article in Life magazine doing what we all sort of do in our culture, like every 5 or 10 years, we wring our hands and say, why aren't kids learning? Why aren't they reading? Why are test scores down? And you always try to find some reason, whether, it's video games or it's social media or it's comic books or whatever. What John Hersey said is children aren't learning to read because the children's primers we give them, which in this case was still the Dick and Jane books, literally Dick and Jane books. He said Dick and Jane are awful. The books are, they're boring. The art is terrible. Nobody's interested in Dick and Jane and their lives of quiet desperation. They want something fun. Why don't you just get Dr. Seuss to illustrate one, for crying out loud? He mentions Dr. Seuss and Walt Disney and says, why don't you get one of these guys to illustrate one? Maybe that would help. And Seuss actually has a friend who publishes children's books and who says, I don't want you to just illustrate one. I want you to write a book that a first grader can't put down. But the catch for it is Dick and Jane, the one thing they have going for them is that there's a pedagogy to Dick and Jane. There is an educator-approved word list based on grade level. So if you're aiming for like a first or third grade reading level, you've got a vocabulary list of about 400 words. Educator-approved words that they believe children should all know. But you can't deviate from that list. And Seuss equated this to a literary straitjacket. So they hand Seuss this list and they say, write me a book for children. And Seuss stares at this thing for more than a year and just can't get anything down, because getting to your question about is it the art or the story, what he's trying to do first is find the story. And he says at one point, I wanted to write about, he had just written the book On Beyond Zebra, which is about a different kind of alphabet. And he said, I thought it would be interesting to write about it, maybe a queen zebra. Well, zebra's not on the list, and queen's not on the list. He said, maybe I could write something about climbing a mountain. Well, mountain's not on the list. So you can't just add words arbitrarily to the list. And if you want to make something plural, for example, if the pluralized version of that word is not on the list, you can't use it. That's how restrictive it is. So we just talked about the agony of staring at that list for a year. Now, again, Seuss always loved good stories, but I think there's an element of truth to this. What he finally says was, I was going to throw that list across the room, but I decided to look through it one more time and just find things that rhymed, and started working off of that. He said that the first thing he saw which rhymed was tall ball, and that wasn't really a starter. That was a non-starter. But then he saw cat and hat and decided there was enough there, and that was sort of how he got his start. Beyond that, it took him another year to write that book, to write and illustrate that book, again, working with that word list. But when this book comes out, it's lightning in a bottle, because it does a number of things. Kids want to read it because it's hilarious. It doesn't look like any other reading primer they've ever read. It's got Seuss art in it. It's got this cat in it whose feet aren't touching the ground. It's funny. It's got a hook. It's got a hook at the end. It's got sort of an open-ended question at the end, which is, what would you do? So kids love it. Teachers love it because it's got the educator-approved word list, and parents love it because it's not boring. It's a fun book to read out loud to your kids. So he sort of captured all three major audiences for the book. So it's his huge, huge success. His first. Seuss is 52 or 54 years old when this book comes out, and it's his first real major hit. That's when he can finally become Dr. Seuss full time. He doesn't have to keep another day job in advertising. He can dedicate himself now full time to creating more books for children using this pedagogy, using these educator-approved word lists, and sets up his own imprint, which was Beginner Books, that has all these educator-approved word lists for it, and recruiting other writers and authors to write books for this. Like he's the one who finds Stan and Jan Berenstain, and they do the Berenstain Bears. He's their editor. He recruits them to do this and recruits them to draw it. So anyway, that's the moment Seuss sort of has the purpose behind his work. He always thought kids deserve great books. We talked about that in 1949 when he writes down why kids deserve great books. When we get to 1954 and 57, when Cat in the Hat comes out, that's when he says they not only deserve great books, but they deserve, books that can teach them as well without putting them to sleep. And really, nobody has thought of that before. So that's his breakaway hit. Now, weirdly, the other book that comes out in fall that year is The Grinch. Comes out that year. Now, The Grinch doesn't use that word list. Those are what Seuss always called the big books. That didn't use the educator-approved list. So the beginner books like Cat in the Hat and things like Fox and Socks, books like that, they use the educator-approved word list. Books like The Grinch, the Lorax, they don't rely on that educator list. So we sort of had two tiers of books going. But that's the really important moment in his life. Not only because you're starting to get kids books that kids want to read and have this pedagogy, but it's also the moment Seuss can become Seuss sort of full-time.
Wow. Well, I took a message from him. I taught special ed for 25 years, and I had kids who were 16, 17, 18, and who could not read. And I had one in my classroom that he insisted he could not read, and he would not read. And I said, "Well, I think you're lying to me." And he said, "I'm not lying." I said, "Yeah, you are." And so I took his notebook that had every foul word you could possibly imagine written on it. And I put them all up on the board, and I changed letters. And by the end of, I kept them after school, and by the end of, I think, the second hour, my boards were all full of words. And I said, "Okay, so tell me what they say." And by the time he got done with just switching a letter here and there, he said, "I can read all those words." I said, "If you can read all those words, you can read every other word there is." And from that moment on, he was a reader. Of course, I got in big trouble with my principal because my starting list was definitely a couple of them I'm pretty sure he didn't recognize. I didn't either. I had to pull somebody aside and say, what does this mean? And should I never say it? And they would get all red and say, no, don't ever say that one. And it took me a while to actually learn all the words that he had up there. I wasn't going to ask him, but, but by the end of that year, he was actually reading above grade level because he started with all the foul words that he really knew. So, much. So it works. And
what was interesting about Seuss's books is they actually would use them in prisons, and prisoners who couldn't read would read Seuss books, partly because prisoners didn't want people to know they couldn't read. But if you gave them Seuss books, everybody was reading Dr. Seuss books. So they said it really encouraged even non-readers to read.
Oh, absolutely. And even if it's just, I know with my son, it was from memory, from seeing me read it and point to it over and over again. Not sure he got the concept of it, but he could read the word, and then all you have to do is switch a letter, and you've got cat, hat, pat, tat. It's if the kid understands that the sounds create the words, all they have to do is learn the sounds. So,
well, and that's what's so fun. If you read The Cat in the Hat and you know what you now know about how it's got the pedagogy behind it, and it's Seuss using the educator word list, watch how he's working. As you said, there's a lot of repetition in there. And then there's one page even where the cat is balanced on a ball and he starts juggling. And it's a moment that Seuss can sort of download a whole bunch of words off his word list, because it talks about how he's juggling a boat and a car and a man, and you see this little action figure he's juggling, a ball, a plate, a cake, a rake. Everything, he just downloads a ton of words off that list on that single page right there. Now the thing Seuss always was, when he was training other writers to use those word lists and writing books like, for example, Go Dog Go. A lot of people, when I was starting to write Seuss, would say, oh my God, I love Go Dog Go. That's actually not written or drawn by Seuss. He edited it, but didn't draw it. Or Are You My Mother is also not a book that he wrote or illustrated, but he edited that book. But, he would explain to them, you can't draw something, for example, that's not referenced in the words. If you're writing about a bird with a ball, and you show on your page a bird with a ball, and in the background there's a doghouse, you can't do that because that's not mentioned on the page. It was a very strict set of rules he had imposed on himself and other writers, because he wanted to be sure he was being absolutely fair to the reader. I think one of the very first books he edited was. I can't remember. It's about an owl and a firefly, and I think the owl's name is Sam. And the word owl is actually not on the approved word list, but I don't believe they ever actually call the owl an owl. He's always just Sam. And that made Seuss crazy, that they weren't actually using the word owl when they were drawing him as the main character. But that's actually one of the best-selling of those books under the beginner book imprint. And that was one that sort of violated the rules. But Seuss had a very strict set of rules, and not everybody could write under that. It was very hard to stick with those rules. And eventually Seuss himself started to move away from the word list. Even he kind of threw some of it to the wind, and he would make plurals if that weren't always allowed. I think at that point he thought, well, he knew what he was doing enough. But there was another editor he was working with who was very strict about that word list, and he got to the point where it wasn't quite so much. But, he sat at the helm of beginner books for a long, long time. That was really important to him. Some of the books in that collection he wrote and drew, some he did not. Sometimes he would have a book that another writer had started, for example, and maybe they couldn't handle the word list, or they couldn't follow the rules the way he wanted to, and sometimes he would have to step in and rescue those books. And when that happens, though not always, but if you see a book by, I can't remember the name, Lesieg is how he credits it. The book will be Lesieg, which is Geisel spelled backwards. That's a book that he that's a book that he probably rescued.
Well, how did he actually? I mean, he did not have a doctorate, so how did he become Dr. Seuss? What?
So he actually started
signing his work.
He started signing his work as Dr. Seuss back in the 1920s, I believe. I think 1928 might have been the first time it actually appeared, and it's because he was writing humorous pieces for Judge magazine, and he had this one single page about the history, I think, of bridge, and yet there's a drawing illustrating it, but he's writing this very tongue-in-cheek, erudite piece about the history of bridge, and so he wants you to take him seriously, so he signs it Dr. Theodor Geisel, I think, or Dr. Theodor Seuss, I think is what he said. But he just added that name, doctor, on the front of it to make it sound like he was much more serious than he really was. You have to believe it if it was written by a doctor, don't you? So that was where the nickname Dr. Seuss came from. Now, if you want to be a purist, he's of German extraction. It's actually Seuss, not Seuss, but no one ever pronounced it that way.
Oh, okay. And the first name, Giselle? What?
Geisel. It's Geisel.
Geisel. Oh, Geisel. I made it French.
Yeah, no, it's very German. His family was all German brewers. It's a very German name. And it's Theodore with no E on the end.
My.
His father was also Theodor Geisel, as was his grandfather, which made writing that first chapter really tough.
I would think so.
I ended up calling them, I think, by their full names every time.
I think what makes the books that, I've only read 2, so I can't be global about this, but what I have found fascinating about the 2 books that I've read is that you are so meticulous about, really going into the background of the people that he was with, and you go into their background as well, so that, you become so familiar with the subject. Do you ever confuse yourself and become it?
Not really. I'm not one of these people, though, who can compartmentalize. So I have a colleague who wrote a really great book about Richard Nixon, and I don't know that I could live with Nixon for the 5 years it takes us to do this. I need somebody who was kind of in my lane and who I might want to hang out with. So I need a character more like that. I never get my lines blurred on that, but I love to be the fly on the wall of the creative process. That to me is the most interesting part of the stories, which is why I like to look at the people they worked with and try to give you a little idea of those people and the background for them. Sense of place. Robert Caro always talks about how sense of place is so important, and I absolutely agree with that. Why did Seuss love sitting in that office on the top floor of his home that overlooked the ocean? He had ocean views on all 3 sides. If you see that room, you understand now why he loves that room so much, and why he was able to treat what he did as a job. I think that's one of the things that's so impressive and important about Seuss is his entire life he worked, meaning he got up every morning, ate breakfast, and went to sit at his desk at 9 o'clock in the morning, and he would stay there until 5. And if ideas came, he wrote and drew all day, and if they didn't, he still stayed there at that desk. He wasn't going to move. He wasn't going to go out to the golf. He wasn't going to say screw it and go out to the golf course. He might stand and look out the window, but he wasn't going to leave that office. That office was such an important room to him, partly because he had disciplined himself enough to sit there and do the work. And you have people nowadays who talk about 10,000 hours, how it takes 10,000 hours to get, extraordinary at anything. Seuss put in those hours every day, whether the words came or whether a squiggle of a line of a drawing came, he was at that desk doing the work, which I think is a really incredible, I've never added up the hours, but it's a really incredible work ethic. Did it his entire life. Well, now, even as he got older, he might cut down the number of hours, but he still always went and sat down at that desk. I think it's, that room and that desk were so important to him that even in his last years as he was ill, he moved into that room. He had the couch that he loved so much made into his bed, and he stayed in that office. It's the room that he died in. it was so important to him.
That's what Hemingway did. He stood at his typewriter for 8 hours a day, whether he wrote or not.
Yeah, that's what George Lucas did that when he had to sit down to write Star Wars, and Lucas always talked about how he was such a terrible writer, but he would sit down at that desk every morning and sit there and try to do 5 pages a day, whether they were good pages or not. He would try to get those pages down, and then at the end of the day, he had this calendar hanging over his desk, and he would draw a big fat X through the date at the end of the day to mark that he had finished yet another day. But it was, he called it bleeding on the page. It was absolute misery, but he made himself sit there.
Well, now, I can understand Henson. I can understand Dr. Seuss. I can even understand George Lucas. How in the name of heaven did Washington Irving get into this group?
Well, he was actually my first one.
I know.
And he actually, it turns out he's another iconic creative. I didn't know that all 4 of them actually fit together. They all were sort of innovators in their chosen field. They were, there were no sets of rules. Irving's the first American to make his living solely by writing. No one had ever done that before. Irving is the one that figures out how to do viral marketing before viral marketing exists. He figures out what it's like to be a famous author and how if you want to build an addition to your house, you write a novel or you write a book because it'll be a bestseller. So that was what I found fascinating about Irving was his personality almost more than the work. The work is really important to him, but what I loved is he's like Forrest Gump almost in that, I'd get to one chapter and I'd go, oh my God, I get to write like he's going to be Dickens in this chapter. This is going to be great. Oh my God, Mary Shelley wants to date him. How this is going to be so great. Oh my God, he's going to meet 14-year-old Edgar Allan Poe. He knows everybody famous. But I actually got into him. I didn't know that much about him until I started the research on him as well. As an English major, we're taught, you get Rip Van Winkle maybe in a collection, and we all sort of know Legend of Sleepy Hollow. It's one of those sort of American DNA stories. But yeah. I fell in love with his work through his Christmas stories. What I didn't know, and this was how I found him, is I'd been reading a book about the history of Christmas in the United States because I'm a huge Christmas junkie, and it talked about how all these traditions that we think go back ages, that we think that they're English traditions that we adapted, like the Yule log and wassail and Christmas carols and children and gifts. Basically, Irving made all those traditions up and then just told us that they were old traditions, which I had never heard before. So I went and I found the short stories. They're hidden in plain sight. It's 5 short stories right in the middle of a collection called the Sketchbook. Sketchbook is 32 short stories. The first story is Rip Van Winkle. The last story is Legend of Sleepy Hollow, and then nobody knows any of the other, 33 or 34 in there. But there's 5 of them right in the middle. That is Irving's main narrator, a guy named Jeffrey Cram. I can't remember who it is. Anyway, he pulls up on Christmas Eve in front of Squire Bracebridge's house, and he stays for Christmas. And Irving goes through all these old traditions and, lays everything out that we think of as traditional Christmas. And the entire time he's turning to the reader and going, like, you all know this is baloney, right? I mean, he's letting the reader in on the joke, but we don't care because it's so interesting, it's so cool that we sort of started to grab those traditions as our own. And those stories were actually hugely influential on Dickens and framed a lot of the way Dickens set up in A Christmas Carol. So Dickens sort of is telling stories of Christmas traditions that didn't exist either because he was using Washington Irving as his source. Now, Irving and Dickens turned out to be mutual friends and admirers of each other, which is a chapter that I loved writing. But that was really how I found Irving, is I loved those Christmas stories, and his voice was so modern. I was expecting to read Nathaniel Hawthorne and have sort of this Puritan prose to it, and Irving doesn't do that. Like I said, he's constantly breaking the fourth wall, turning to the reader and saying, like, we know Squire Bracebridge is crazy, right? Like, what he's telling us is not true. Just this really fun, very American voice, and I just fell in love with that voice and that character, and it turned out that he was such an interesting guy. I got dinged in one of the reviews in the Washington Post because they were saying, well, Jones doesn't really spend a lot of time doing literary criticism. And I thought, God, who's got time to do that when Mary Shelley's trying to date him? It's just his life is just so interesting. There was so much going on. But like I said, he really does fit in with my other three because he's an innovator. He's like Jim Henson. Nobody had done puppets on TV until Jim Henson did, and he really figured out the way you make them work. George Lucas is doing Star Wars, which no one understands, but he does, and he starts creating the technology he needs to make it happen. Nobody's writing for a living in 1819, not in America. Irving's the one who figures out like how you run these traps. How do you prevent people from pirating your work? Even though we have a clause in the Constitution that's like all about copyright, all people had to do was take your book and if you buy it in Philadelphia and sail across the sea to London, then they can print it in London, and you're screwed. Irving figured out how to like get around all these rules, like really advocated on the part of writers. So he's such an interesting and innovative guy that he himself is greater than some of his parts. I mean, his work is, I don't want to say incidental because it's very important, but I mean, he is a character and as an innovator is what I found so interesting. So he really does fit with those other three.
Amazing. Well, I definitely do want to get a hold of you, and we're going to do the Lucas book for sure.
All right.
And I have to admit, every now and then I sit down and think, okay, so who else might fit into this pattern or genre that you have created? And I've thought about and tossed out dozens of names. I mean, they're just from my understanding of the pattern that I have seen in the two books that I've read. Who else might fit into this sort of pattern? Not exactly, but this sort of pattern. And so, I mean, George and Ira Gershwin come to mind. They were creative geniuses, unbelievable, and you've got to find. I understand it has to be somebody that really you relate to, and you just want to dive in head first and submerge yourself for 5 years.
I mean, like I love Duke Ellington, but I'm probably not the right person to write a Duke Ellington book. I love Chaplin. Now there's a Chaplin book actually coming out this month. He was one that for a long time there were a lot of books on him, and then he sort of fell off the mantelpiece, and they're starting to write about him again. I've never written about a musician, so I really was trying to think of a really creative groundbreaker. People were telling me I should have done David Bowie because sort of the holy trinity in Jim Henson's life is there's a moment when Jim Henson, George Lucas, and David Bowie are all working together on Labyrinth, and so people were like, you have to do David Bowie next. You've already done Henson and Lucas. Somebody's already done a really good job with Bowie. So the hard part is if you pick an icon, which are the subjects that I tend to take on. It's often hard to find icons that haven't been done or haven't been done recently, and there's sometimes, in my opinion, where I don't think they've been done well. So that makes it hard because a lot of times there are books out there on subjects. You and I were talking before the show. I'm a huge Beatles fan, and I really wanted to write a book on Ringo. I've never done a musician either, and I actually made a serious run at him, and he finally told me no. I did the same thing to Mick Jagger. Now, is Ringo a book I could write without ever interviewing him? Probably. But again, he's never been done. He's never sat down for the big interview. Lucas wouldn't talk to me, but that cat has been talking on the record since 1964. Like, he just sits down. There's just, thousands and thousands of hours of interviews with him. Ringo's probably the same way, but, he's never, Lucas has sat down for a biographer once in his life. Now, he hated the book, which is why he's never sat down with another biographer again. But Ringo's never even done that. So, without him, it's not a book that I could have really done. I would have loved to have done a book like that. Wow.
It just well, when you put those parameters on it, it is a tough. I mean, you've got. You've certainly got a lot of 5 years left in you. So
yeah. Now the book I'm writing right now is I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm writing a history of the U.S. Capitol building because I was congressional staffer. I worked in that building for almost 10 years, and it's a story that hasn't been done. It's been done as tourist documents and as kind of architectural histories, but no one's ever done sort of a grand tour of the building as a character in history. And what I find so fascinating about the Capitol is the building itself is fascinating, but there are so many interesting characters surrounding it as well. So that's what I'm really hoping I can bring to life again, is I love the creative process. And there's a huge creative process going constantly into that building and bickering over who's going to do what and what it's going to look like, and having to run it all the way up the line to the President of the United States to have them make a decision on things. And it's just been a really fascinating book. It's taking me longer than I want it to, but I'm hoping it will be out in 25 at this point.
Oh, my goodness. Well, judging from the length of your other books, I can understand why it would probably take that long.
I'm trying not to do that one again with this one. Yeah, I'm what is Henson's like 587, and then Lucas I think it's 603, and Seuss I can't remember. I think it's 500 something. Yeah, I can't shut up apparently, can I, Barbara?
No, I have found that, but happily it was interesting.
Yeah,
and
that's often the hard part. Is it's not just what goes into a book, but what doesn't go in can often be as hard.
Well, I can remember having a 600-page book on flints, and I have read 600 pages on archaeology and flints, and I don't ever need to read another one again, ever. I mean, I don't look at how many pages a book is. I usually look into the book, and if it's something that fascinates me, I'll book the author no matter how long it is. But I think Gary Wayne is a very prolific writer. His first book was Genesis 6 Conspiracy, and he's got the second volume coming out. And when I took a look at it, and it wasn't the number of pages, it was the material he covered, and there were 7 sections. And when I spoke with him about doing an interview, I said, this is not a 1-week interview. This is a 7-week interview, one week on every section. And he said, let's do it. So,
there you go.
I mean, I got 2 months of shows booked already. It's really cool.
Outstanding.
And it means I can enjoy reading it and not have to really keep plowing. But your books are fascinating, and I in my spare time I will. What about Spielberg, or is there too much done on him?
He was recently done a really spectacular book by Joseph McFarland, I think is that his name? McBride? I can't remember. And it's thicker than my book. All right, it is a humongous book. Fantastic. I used it as my primary resource on Spielberg when I was writing the Lucas book, in fact.
Oh, my.
Yeah, it's gigantic. It's a phone book, yeah.
Well, there can be too much about somebody, too.
True.
And you don't need to have the genealogy of the milkman. But you don't do that. So, but there are so many. You do it so well. It would be such fun to see you do a lot of these people, because you have a unique way of doing it, and I don't think anybody else copies your style. So it's sort of like.
I appreciate that, and I hope to keep on doing them. So.
Well, it's funny because now Mark Eddy interviewed you on your book on Washington Irving, and I'm highly tempted because Mark and I interview so differently. I'm highly. I may well come back at Washington Irving after we do Lucas, because Mark comes from, we come from different backgrounds, so that his interview and my interview will cover different aspects in different areas totally. So, and in many cases we've spaced it out so it's not obvious, but we've done the same author, and the interviews always pull out different aspects of the book. So it's never a downside to have 2 different interviewers come at you from 2 different directions. So I'm definitely, I will dive into him, because he's like Mozart, a fabulous. Well, Mozart I'm sure has been done up the wazoo, but or Nostradamus. That would be fun too. But not a lot of, well, there's a lot written, but it would be fascinating to see you do one of those guys, because while there is a lot of literature out there for it, it's not done the way you do it. So I wouldn't let that stop you. But at one point in time, there were Dr. Seuss books that got kind of blacklisted, I guess. I don't know what else you'd call it. And, why?
So you've got 6 books that Seuss Enterprises, which is the business that Audrey, his widow, set up after he died. It's called Seuss Enterprises, Dr. Seuss Enterprises, that manage the company now on his behalf. And they take care of the branding and they take care of the licensing, but they also administer his estate and his books. And God, was it 2 years ago now? It seems it's gone so fast. They decided to let 6 books go out of print. They never banned them or anything like that, but they just let them go out of print. And it's when people start to get wrapped around the axle on it, it's 6 books that I don't think anybody could actually name. Like now, probably the biggest name on the list is, and to think that I saw it on Mulberry Street, is first one, because that one's got, as I said a little earlier, a problematic depiction of a Chinese person. Initially it says something about a Chinaman who eats with sticks, and Seuss drew this, very racist version of a Chinese person. That he tried to, even in his lifetime, understood that was problematic and tried to fix it and still never really got it fixed. So they let that one go out of print. There's another one, I think one of the other books is If I Ran the Zoo. And that one is, I think, one of his best as far as the rhyme goes in it. But that's another one that when Seuss has to draw exotic cultures, he tends to get what I call pictographically lazy. So the way he tends to draw an exotic culture is they have slant eyes, or they dress like African natives did in movies from the 1930s. It's in the same way that rich people in Seuss books wear monocles and top hats. I mean, he's being pictographically lazy on this. It's racist. It's racist work. I don't think Seuss himself is a racist, but it's definitely racist work. And I think Seuss Enterprises got a little weary of people constantly, rightly pointing it out that they just decided to let the books go out of print. Sometimes you see them pop up on eBay for hugely expensive prices, but they let them go out of print, and there's parts of those books that I think are still important to the Seuss story. Like If I Ran the Circus is one of the books that is on the list. That book is the first time you'll see the word nerd appear anywhere in American English. Seuss created that word, and at the time that he used it, it was a word he gave to a kind of bird that has like a sweater on. It's really weird looking, and it very quickly took on the meaning that we now give to it. I mean, within like a year of that book coming out. So, there's still interesting stuff in those books, but I can see why, I totally understand why Seuss Enterprises took them out of circulation, because, it really has to do with, depiction of exotic cultures and representation, things like that. Seuss, even in his lifetime, he acknowledged that work he had done during World War II, for example, was really terribly racist pictographically, especially the way he depicted Chinese people or Japanese people. Now, his work at that time is no worse than even American propaganda was at that time. And Seuss never depicted the Japanese as apes, for example, as some editorial cartoonists did. But, there's some work in that period that's kind of the low point of his career. It's not a good look. Seuss, in his lifetime, said, when I did that work, I thought it was funny at that. And now I'm not so sure. So, it was something that he even reckoned with in his lifetime. People often said to him, like, there are no women in your books. And his response was, if you can tell me which of my characters is female, I'll leave you something in my will. I mean, that gets to that issue of how his stuff doesn't look like anything else. Now, where he got in trouble with that was in, I think it's in Mulberry Street again. He talks about something was so obvious that even Sue could think of that. Like he puts his foot in it in that one, and that was one that somebody rightly pointed that out to him in his lifetime, and he acknowledged that that was a bonehead move. So like I said, this is something Seuss himself even reckoned with before he died, and that the estate I think was still working with and still struggling with especially over the last maybe decade or so, and finally just decided to let those books go out of print. Now, it's again also not the first Seuss books that have been taken out of print. In Seuss's lifetime, 2 of his books went out of print, so it is not unheard of for his books to go out of print either.
Well, if anybody out there is looking to find any of these books, if you go to ABE Books, you can find them, because If I Ran the Circus is there for $5. So,
is it really? Okay, well, there you go.
Yeah. So I love ABE Books because, when somebody, gets smart and tries to take something out of publication, it's not really, it's out of publication, but there are places you can find them, and ABE Books is a great place to look. I know If I Ran the Circus is there, but I didn't go beyond that one, but I would imagine possible to pick up some of the other ones there as well. And not a bad idea to do it, by the way.
Nope, probably not. Yeah, because they're on Amazon, they're expensive, but if you can get them over ABE, it's probably a better place to go.
Yeah, that's my favorite place to go, actually.
Yeah, they're a great resource.
It's kind of, oh, geez, yeah. So if I kind of, there's one of the books, and I can't remember the name of it, where the two towns or whatever, the whole population is divided by people who are black on one side and white on the other, and then it's the reverse in the other one, and I can't remember the name of the book.
So that sounds like the Sneetches, and that has to do with having stars on your belly. Some of them have stars on their belly, some don't. And then eventually a snake oil salesman comes along, and he's got a machine that can give anybody a star. And then what happens is everybody starts getting stars, and they come to realize that they're ultimately meaningless, which is sort of the lesson you can take away from the blue checks on Twitter now, I guess. But that was his story. That was sort of one of his a deliberately messagey book, which he didn't do very often.
I can find spiritual messages everywhere here. So, to me it was amazing, and it reminded me a little bit of a Star Trek episode where they were arguing and wrestling through time, and there was no difference.
Black on one half, and the other guy's black on the other half. Yeah, it's the Sharon. It's a great one.
So that there's a message there if you want to dig for it. Other than that, it's a great story, but it's teaching you a message, and I think that some of us just take things so casually and so subliminally, we don't look for something else there as far as the message goes. And whether he intended it or not, the message is there, and constantly. And I think one of the other things that you brought out that was so incredibly sweet was how well he related to children. And you mentioned somewhere, it's mentioned in your material, that he never talked down to anybody, but he not only did he not talk down, he talked to children the same way he would talk to an adult, which was phenomenal, and I think very appropriate. I know I never baby talk to my son, never. Mm-hmm. And I think you're respecting the spirit within as being the same as yours, perhaps not in a different size package, but it's still there. And I think that children picked up on that and paid a lot more attention to his wisdom than parents often give credit to.
Yeah, well, and as you and I talked about at the beginning of this, I think that's one of the reasons his work still sells and still resonates is because Seuss never talks down to his audience. He's right in the eye. He's meeting them at their level. He never thinks that they're stupid. I talked with Mike Fritz, who was one of Seuss's editors as a young man even, and he said, we always assumed that our audience was smarter than we were, talking about the kids. And that was one of the things that Seuss would tell aspiring children's book writers. He said, understand they're the hardest group to write for, because if you try to pull a fast one on them, they will see you coming a mile away. He's like, adults are easy to fool, kids are not, and they will call you out on it. One of Seuss's famous quotes, he says that adults are basically outdated children, and to hell with them. So he had all the respect in the world for kids, and just I think that's why he put all that's why he put all that work into pinning those books up on the wall and seeing the way they looked on the page. He was really thinking about the way that book was going to, as an object in a child's hands. Is the line too long? The rhyme scheme works, but is the line too long? Is it going to run into the seam in the middle, and the kid won't be able to read the last word very well? Have to bend the page to read it. Seuss thought of all of that from the kid's perspective. Nobody was doing that, and I think that's why his work is so timeless. Why it's so tough. I think Seuss would be appalled when we hear that Madonna's writing a book, or Oprah's going to write a kid's book, or whatever. It's like they always talk about, I'm going to write this children's book. Seuss would think that was feeding the kids, because it's not easy to do. Seuss would argue that it's not easy to do. Not everyone is cut out to write a children's book. I think he would be disappointed by this thing to put out, celebrity children's books, because to him they were to be taken very seriously. They were not to be tossed off casually. It was really hard work, and it would take him, sometimes years to write these books, because every single detail, down to the color, mattered. Sending the crayons to the publisher, to the printing house, match this specific color. He had to figure out what color oobleck was, so that they could match that color. Everything mattered.
What was the point of, I know that at one point when a book was about to come out or about to be published, he would go down to the publishers and he would read it to the people there.
Yeah, whenever he would submit, when a book was finished, he would take it to Random House personally, and he would go to Bennett Cerf, who was the publisher and the owner of Random House, a real character. Somebody's been working on a bio of him, by the way, for I think 10 or 15 years at this point. Her name's Gail Feldman, and she needs to get it done here because I want to read it. But he would take it to Bennett Cerf's office, and he would read it aloud and hold the pages up so everybody could see the art on the pages. So it was one of those. It was a big production. People could not wait for him to come in with the latest Seuss books, so he could read them out loud.
Was there a point to it?
No,
did he? I think in a way it was saying, this is what it's going to feel like when you read it to a child.
I think that's a great point. I wish I had thought of that, actually. I'm a little mad that I didn't think of that. No, I think that's probably, this is what it's like reading to a kid. You read the words and you hold it up, or they're sitting in your lap and they're looking at both. And I think that's a great point. Darn it, Barbara, I wish I thought of that.
Well, geez, I should have asked me. No, it great sense that if you can enthrall the child within an adult, you've got something here. Because adults come in with one level of awareness, and if you can take them back to being a child and being enthralled by the magic of the words, then you've got it. Then actually, at that moment in time, the adult is a better critic, because you have to reach the child within each of those people. And if you can do that, you can reach a child.
I think that gets to why, something like Sesame Street was so successful, because it was aimed at both audiences, the kids and the adults, and it never talked down to either audience.
Yeah, it's just didn't they even almost create a stage for him at one time?
A stage
or
for
a
Seuss to
setting?
read?
Yeah.
So when he was the editor of the beginner books, they essentially gave him the top floor of suites at Random House, and he elevated everything up off the floor, so it was almost like kid sized. But it was like, being in a tree house, and it was just, it was very whimsical, and you would walk up these stairs into these very Seussian offices. So, yeah, it was one of those places that he loved to bring people to those offices at Random House. It was something constructed just for him.
Well, Bennett Cerf absolutely recognized the creative genius that he had. I mean, he was
Bennett Cerf, the publisher at Random House. He's publishing people like James Joyce, like some really heavy hitters. And he said on the record, he said, we publish a lot of authors, a lot of great writers at Random House, but we only publish one true genius, and that true genius is Dr. Seuss.
He was. I almost, am curious as to did he illustrate his will? I mean, that was something that I would think he would do.
No, he did not. He did not. No.
I've often thought about putting my will.
He did get to do something
that not
a lot of people get to do with their fans, is that Seuss did get to say goodbye to his readers. His last book, which is Oh, the Places You'll Go, which is one of his biggest selling books to this day, because again, it's timeless enough. People give it to people at graduation and when they get new jobs and when they move to new cities, and it's Seuss sort of putting everything into that one book that he has learned and that he's loved. And you'll see, tips of the hat to his old advertising work. You'll see people standing in line that look like they came out of an ad from like 1928, one of his old cartoons from, Flit. But it's, it's him talking about Off and Away. And he did not read that one personally at Random House. He was too old and sick by that time, but he had it delivered to Random House. And Michael Frith, who I mentioned earlier, who was one of his editors, was no longer working at Random House, but had come to visit and saw that book with the big pages laying on a flat had just been delivered. And he opened it up and started reading through it. And he said to someone else, he said, you know what this is, don't you? He is telling us all goodbye. So Seuss got to go out on his own terms, which a lot of creatives don't get to do. Well, you look at somebody like Jim Henson, who died at 53, didn't get to go out on his own terms. Seuss got to go out on his own terms, which is pretty cool as a creative.
Well, yeah, but he didn't have to go out. He just didn't go to the doctor.
Well, I mean, yes and no. Yeah, on that one, but I don't think Jim knew how ill he was when that happened.
I'm sure.
I'm not sure going to the doctor, even had he done it days earlier, would have necessarily saved him. That's one where he, when I was writing that book, I got swine flu when I was in London, and I understand because I literally thought I might die, and you know what I did? Nothing. Because I thought, well, I'm in my 40s and I'll get over it because that's what happens. And really, I mean, come on, no one's going to die of this. And I got over it, and I felt terrible, and I really think that's kind of what Jim thought is, I'm 53. This isn't going to be anything fatal. It's just a bad case of the flu, and just did not really know or appreciate how sick that he was. Yeah, I mean, I've had people say, well, because he was a Christian Scientist, and Christian Scientists, Jim was not a practicing Christian Scientist at that time. He had doctors. He went to the doctor to get insured for making his movies. He wasn't doctor reverse. It was just, I just don't think, Jim's problem at that time was he was a dude, and dudes don't go to the doctor. We just don't have guys that we go to regularly. Jim did not have a guy, didn't have a doctor he went to regularly.
Well, also, there's an element of I have so much left to do. Not in the case of Dr. Seuss, obviously, but I think that so many times people who have a genius, it's a matter of I have a lot to do. I don't have time. I mean, I don't put myself in that.
That is the irony of Jim's life, is because when Jim was was still in high school, or just started college, his older brother died in an automobile accident. I think Jim understood that there were that life is short, that there may never be enough time. I think he knew that, which is why I think a lot of his early work centers around time. One of his first short films is called Timepiece. So I think that is the sad irony in Jim's life, is that he did worry there would never be a time, which is why he's just perpetually in motion, which unfortunately then turned out to be true.
Well, how old was he when he died? Well,
53.
You're talking Henson. Yeah.
Yeah, Henson. Yeah, Seuss was
wow.
84, I think, or maybe even older than that.
It just, and there doesn't seem to be anybody around at this point in time. I mean, maybe the Harry Potter stuff, but that's older.
Well, and I think that's fair, and I think I use that example in the epilogue to the book because, even though Rowling is aiming her work at a slightly older audience than Seuss did, she made reading fun and entertaining and interesting for kids. And that, for Seuss, was the real job, was give kids books that they deserve. Give kids books that they want to read. Don't give kids a book you think they should be reading. Seuss always said that was the cruelest thing you could do to a kid, is give them what you thought was a good book. Let kids find the books. And I think that's what J.K. Rowling does with those books, is kids wanted to read. I mean, you would see kids lined up at midnight at the bookstore to buy the latest Harry Potter. He made reading fun again, and that was what Seuss saw as his mission, was reading. People don't read because they don't read because they find some books boring. And Seuss thought that was the worst thing you could do, was be boring. And Rowling, I think, is the legit error in that regard, because you had kids carrying around these books that were 900 pages long. You had fifth graders carrying them around to read them. You didn't see that. I mean, that didn't exist until she came along. She actually made, young adults hip again.
Well, there is a spin-off of them, too, so, we'll see where she goes with that. But, quite often a spin-off for something, that is that famous, they don't work, but her spin-off seems to, be doing well. I don't know what you can't compare it to the other stuff, because, she could retire happily on that, but she has a mind that's full of magic, so I would imagine it will continue.
Yeah, and you've seen Seuss Enterprises every, 3 years or so, they find an undiscovered, manuscript of Seuss that they trot out and publish. Like they had the one, I can't remember, What Pet Should I Get, I think was one that came out. And, again, talking with people who knew and who'd worked with Seuss, said, I understand why Seuss Enterprises is doing that. They like to keep expanding the brand. But they said, there's a reason Seuss put this in what he called his bone pile. This is where he put discarded ideas. I think Seuss would be horrified that some of those books have seen light of day. We might think they're amazing, but there's a reason he put them in his bone pile. I think he would just think it was awful that people are going through his old abandoned manuscripts to find things by him to publish, to produce new Seuss books.
Well, it's funny because they've made a movie of a cartoon of the Lorax. They've made a movie of Horton. They've made I don't know how many of them have become a cartoon. Hopefully, they're not going to do to him what they've done, to Disney, where they've taken the cartoons and put real people in them, which is terrifying. What they did to Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
They did that to the Grinch. Like, I know people who their favorite version of the Grinch is the Jim Carrey Grinch. So sometimes it works, but on the other hand, they did it with Cat in the Hat, and it was a disaster.
Well, yeah, the cartoon for some reason is just so much lighter, and you flow with it, and you love the dog, and it's just Jim Carrey was good, but it's just not the cartoon, and I'm old. I remember the book, and then I remember the cartoon, and to have it be unanimated disappointed me. It took the magic out of it. That's what it does.
Right.
It takes the magic out. And you kind of wonder where he would have gone with it, where he would have taken it. Would he have gone into space with it? Would he have, what would he have done?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't do them in books. He did let the Grinch and the Cat in the Hat meet in a TV, like a half-hour TV show once. It was called, like, Halloween Night is Grinch Night, I think is what it's called, and I think it's the two of them meeting. But I don't think he would ever have done that in the books. He was a little more deliberate with the books.
Yeah, it's he wrote, what, 60-some, you said?
I think 65, yeah.
Wow. It sends me back to wanting to sort of reconfigure my library again, because his alliteration, his poetry, it had such magic to it, and it had it right from the very beginning. I mean, some of his early work, not necessarily books, but his drawings. Was he doing these kinds of drawings? When did the cartoons start, or were they always there?
His style sort of evolved, but I mean, you look at his work in college even, and the look is there already. And by the time he's doing his cartooning for Vanity Fair, he never did the New Yorker, but Life magazine and things. I mean, he's already got his style set, and wasn't going to mess with that too much. I mean, again, you can tell a Dr. Seuss drawing the minute you see it. There's like I said, there's things about it you don't know why. You start to realize everybody's got eyelashes and things like that. But there's Seuss's artwork has a look that you can notice a mile away, and he came upon it very early. So if you see Seuss cartoons from the 20s versus books he was doing in the 70s, they still look very similar. He stuck with the style that worked for him. Now he would often say that he's drawing. He said he would look at a bear and draw it, and people would say this doesn't look anything like a bear, and he'd say, well, that's the way it looks to me. but his wife said that the joints come out all wrong, and that he can't actually draw anatomy. And Seuss just said, yeah, this is the way it looks to me. So I think he would say I'm doing the best I can, but it gave him a very distinct look.
It did. Now, Green Eggs and Ham is the best-selling Seuss book out there, which surprises me. What was it that made it a bestseller?
So that book has one of the smallest word lists of any of the Seuss books. So it's early readers can grab it. It was the result of a bet between he and Bennett Cerf after Cat in the Hat came out. And Cat in the Hat is aimed at, maybe third grade readers, and so it had a much larger vocabulary list that Seuss could choose from. After Cat in the Hat came out, Bennett Cerf said, okay, smart guy, I'll bet you $50 you can't write a book that uses 100 unique words or less, or maybe even said 50 unique words or less. And Seuss won that bet, although, as he always said, Bennett Cerf never paid him. And that's the book that becomes Green Eggs and Ham. And again, when you read that book, watch what he's doing to win that bet. Is he's repeating the same words over and over, just in different order. Would you have them with the box? No, I would not have them at the box. Would you eat them with the fox? I would not eat them with the fox. I will not eat them with the fox. I will not eat them in a box. It's the same words over and over again. But Seuss is using them so rhythmically, you almost don't even notice. So it lets him get away with a very, very small word list. And so there's I think the only words in there that he's cheating, I think the word somewhere is in that book, and that is not on the word list. But I think Seuss thought it wasn't cheating because the word some is on the list and the word where is on the list. So I think he thought it wasn't cheating to use a word like somewhere. But it's got the shortest word list, unique words of any book. But I think that's what makes that book so popular. Is you can read that book in kindergarten. Cat in the Hat you probably read in kindergarten, but it's a little bit it's got a bigger word list and it's a little more complicated. Fox, Green Eggs and Ham is a very simple concept. It's trying to get somebody to do something they don't want to do, and that's really it. And every little kid has been part of that. They've been on the receiving end of it. They've been on the other end as well, trying to get a friend to do something they don't want to do. I think it's a completely relatable setup. I think that's the reason that book still works so well. I think it's the reason kids love it, because every kid's been told to eat something they don't want to eat, or go do something they don't want to do. So I think it's the reason kids love that. And it's just really fun to read. But now that you know the secret behind it, that it's got that short word list, go back and read it again and look at the way he's making that book work. A lot of repetition, a lot of just putting, moving the same words around, using the same 5 words over and over on the page. I think the most used word in that book is Sam, in fact, because that's the punchline at the end of every page.
Mhm. Wow. Yeah, I'm going to have to. I think my introduction was Bartholomew Cubbins and the 500 Hats. Yeah.
Yeah, and again, very different kind of book. That's more of a classic fairy tale kind of book, and kind of terrifying in places. I mean, the king's going to cut his head off at one point in that book. It's sort of it's Seuss's second book, but it's much more like what we think of a traditional fairy tale. It's got a king and it's got a castle and it's got an executioner and off with his head and so on. But it's Seuss trying to figure out his groove back then. It's a very different book than Mulberry Street is, for example. But and he uses Bartholomew Cubbins a couple of times. It's one of his few recurring characters. But it's hard to believe that's the same writer who's giving you Green Eggs and Ham. It's just doing something very different because it's so early in his career.
Well, now when he did the Mulberry Street book, you mentioned that people actually went to Mulberry Street to try to find his house, and it wasn't there. It was on a different street. Yeah, there is a Mulberry Street in Springfield. Seuss does not live on it. He lives on Fairfield, which is a little bit further away. But there is a Mulberry Street for sure in Springfield. Wow. His take on reality was just so incredible. It's almost like, in a way, he lived in a book, and he did weird, funny things. When he cut loose, he really cut loose, and you wonder, where was his reality? Was it on the drawing board, or was it in life itself? I think it was in that office more than anything else. That little office where he worked. I think that was how he would answer that. But he was always working. I mean, if he didn't have a book that was in production at Random House, he had one pinned up on the walls, and at the same time he'd have another one he was, still working on and then first draft on. He always had something going on. Helen had this great quote, which any writer I think can relate to, or maybe even any creative, where she said, he's miserable when he's not working on a book, and he's even more miserable when he is. So, it's one of those things, like doing the book work was hard, but he wanted to be doing it, and when he was done writing the book, he was mad that he wasn't writing a book. So I think anybody can relate to that. Like, he just, he wanted to be doing that work no matter how hard it was. You kind of would love to listen to his head, as things are going around in his head. I know I do a little writing, and often if I go to bed, my head keeps working on what I was working on that prevents me from going to sleep. I'm tired enough to not get up, but I'm also awake enough to not go to sleep. So yeah. I'm wondering if he had a similar, or you do, have a similar experience with that.
Sometimes, but usually it comes about when you're trying to finish something and you can't let it go. You can't not be doing it. It's like people always talk about how their best ideas come in the shower. Well, it's just because you're always thinking. Your brain's always trying to solve the problem you've got. And Seuss often had that problem. He was working, you've got the famous story, too, of Chaplin trying to figure out how a blind girl confuses a tramp for a rich man, into being the sound of a car door slamming. Seuss had that problem with the Lorax, I think, at one point. Like, he ended up going on safari because he was just stuck. and he said there was something about sitting one day and seeing this herd of elephants like overrunning, I think, a swimming pool or something that just brought it, just like the gates opened. Sometimes it just takes something weird to knock the cobwebs out. But Seuss was constantly thinking, and what's so amazing with him is, think about the weird names that he gives to stuff. A Lorax. Like somebody once said, where did you get a name like the Lorax? And he said, well, I drew a picture and it was a Lorax. Which sounds flip, but I think that's really the way his brain worked. Where do you get the word Grinch didn't exist until Seuss made it up. Now, if you tell people to start making up Seussian names, all of our names that we come up with sound so stupid and so forced. It's like when people try to write something like Jabberwocky, like Lewis Carroll's making up words in Jabberwocky. And if anybody else tries to do that, all the words sound made up. There's something about Lewis Carroll's word choice in Jabberwocky that all the words sound organic. And Seuss is really able to do that with the words he picks, the names he gives things. They all sound like they existed already. And that's really tough to do. But I think, that, again, that's an indication of the way that brain is working. There's just something about being able to, tap into that, giving something that's inorganic an organic name, something that didn't exist, giving it a name that makes it sound like it's always existed. Oobleck. Sneezy, Grinch, Lorax, all these, this long list of names, they all sound like they existed, and they didn't until he made it up. Nerd.
Yeah. Well, what gives you personally greatest pleasure? Jumping into a project and researching and struggling with it, or actually finishing it and sitting back and wondering what comes next?
So I think this mainly goes for nonfiction writers, although I'm sure people who write fiction have some catharsis like this. But on nonfiction, we love the research. The research is the most fun part of it because you always feel there's something else you're going to find. But that's also part of your curse, is because you're always worried there's something big that you did not find yet. And so we often say in biography that biography is never finished, it's merely abandoned. Because I would say you don't know what you don't know until you don't know it. And that's what makes you crazy. That's what makes you crazy, especially writing nonfiction. Is, you'll find out, oh my God, I can't believe I didn't find that. I can't believe I didn't know that. I can't believe I didn't think of that. We work very differently than novelists do, or people who are writing, young adult fiction or something. Like they'll talk about they can go to a coffee shop and write for hours. We can't do that because we have to have all our junk with us. We have our binders of information and our backgrounds and our notes and, our books with our quotes and our references and stuff like that. Like we by the time you get everything set up and ready to go, your coffee's cold. So it's a little bit more deliberate the way we have to do it. But it's butt in the chair. So I think the research is the stuff that we really like, because that's the discovery, that's the exploring, that's trying to find something no one's found before. And so I think to a person, you ask biographers at least, what's your favorite part of the process, and we'll all say the research. Now, Washington Irving often said that the best part of writing was having written. And I think you can probably relate to that too, Barbara. I mean, the best part of it is I love going back and reading one of my books and going, oh wow, I really knew what I was doing here. This is really good. You love that feeling. There's times you don't remember writing it, but it's like when you're, there's nothing worse than staring at a blank page. I think the writing is the hardest part. It's the most important part, of course. But when you go back, the best feeling is when you go back years later, for example, to look, sometimes I'll have to go look something up, and I go back and I start reading to find it, and I catch myself still sitting there reading a half hour later, and I go, okay, well, I think I knew what I was doing on this one. This is pretty good still. I read Irving, for example, and that's the one that I'm like, oh, I wish I could go back and do parts of that one over again, because that was my first one. I hadn't quite figured it out yet. And there's places in there where I'm like, oh, I would do that slightly different. I mean, that'll make you insane. But there's places in there I'm like, oh, I would love to do that. I would love to do that one more time. So anyway, I think my favorite part is always still the research and the reading and the discovery and the interviewing and the going to visit. You know, when I was writing this book, I went to Springfield and I went to Seuss's house and I walked down Mulberry Street and I went to the swimming hole and I went to the place where the guy has the mausoleum that inspired the look of some of his architecture, and that we loved it. I went to Dartmouth so I could go see, even though it's much bigger than it was in Israel. I wanted to go see Dartmouth and see where it fits in town. How far away was that from Springfield, and how would you have gotten there? So that's the kind of stuff that we really like. Again, Robert Caro always talked about sense of place. Like he was writing about Lyndon Johnson. He was like, why did Johnson run across the lawn of the Capitol every day? And so Carroll went and did that, and he found out it's because if you ran across the front of the Capitol at that time of day, the sun was hitting it just right, and all the windows were lit. Wow. He talked about, so it's that sense of place. And so, especially in biography, we love that sense of place. What did my subjects see? What were they feeling? What was the smell there when they're doing that? Even if that doesn't even end up in the book, it at least helps you understand sort of where your subject is coming from.
Yeah, I know. Every now and then I will hit across something that I have, and it's like, gee, that's beautiful. I wonder who wrote it. I can't put it up on the website. And then I literally send it through one of those things that will tell me if it's plagiarized or not. And if it's not plagiarized, then it was like, damn, did I write that? And
yeah.
It can be a shock.
Yes, and it's a great feeling when you're like, oh, okay, I was pretty good at that.
Yeah. Every now and then there's a phrase or two that just it's like, or if I'm speaking and I say spout a phrase, part of me says, write it down. You want to use that someplace sometime. And, of course, I never do. But
that is the worst part. Yeah, that's the worst part. I've had moments where I'd be, I'm having a problem with a transition or something, and I'm like, oh, God. And then I'll, be in the shower or something, and I go, there it is. And I won't write it down because I'm like, well, that's so obvious. I'll remember that in the morning. And then, of course, I don't remember it in the morning.
Right. Well, I am excited to see, actually where you go next as far as biographies go. And does it have to be a person?
No, I mean, I'm trying to treat my current subject of the Capitol as I'm calling it, my rough title for it is, Capitol, an American biography. So I'm trying to write this as a biography of a thing, of a inanimate object, which is, I'm hoping, shaping the way I'm thinking about it as I'm writing it. So,
or as a concept, what was it supposed to be?
Yeah,
or
biography is an idea. Yeah.
And wonder what's under the cornerstone, because they always bury something under the.
If they can find it, that's been part of their challenge as well. They're not sure they know where it is.
Well, that's with the White House as well, I think.
Yeah, the one in the Capitol, they think they found it. They're not 100% positive, but because it goes under the southwest corner of where you start. Well, they realized there were several places on that building that could have been the southwest corner, so they're never quite sure. They found something that looked very odd, but they're not 100% sure.
Were the Masons connected to that?
Well, I mean, it was Washington helped lay the cornerstone, and he was a Mason, and so they brought the members of the Masonic Temple, a couple of from the region, one from D.C., one from Alexandria, to help lay it. So it was laid in a Masonic ceremony, which typically ends with a gigantic party, and this one was no different either. But they lay it on top of a silver platter. And they put, corn on top and wine on top. So anyway, so they found something that they thought was a cornerstone, but there was no sign of the silver plate. So they weren't sure if had it been stolen, did maybe it deteriorate, so that's why that's part of the reason that I'm not 100% sure whether they found it or not, because there's no sign of that silver plate.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
Yeah.
It sounds like it might be a really interesting book because, depending on what the philosophy was behind the construction of it and what it was to represent, one would wonder if that conception still holds to this day or not.
True. Yeah. I mean, I still have a long way to go, so I've got a lot of things like that to think about.
Well, I think it's fascinating. Of course, I love the people, but of course we'll have to do the capital too. So, but if we've got 3 or 4 years to go, I figure I can fit you in someplace in that.
There you go. That works great.
Yeah, no, it's. I think one of the joys of doing this show is that I get to talk to all of you guys who have done such amazing things, and for a moment, kind of interact with you and find out where you were coming from and where you were going, and learn a lot. I mean, I often tell people that Nightlight is my PhD. I've read almost 1,000 books in the 15 years. And spoken with the authors, and I've learned a tremendous amount. Better than I have 2 masters, but this is my PhD, and I am just having such a delightful time. It's far more enjoyable to be able to pick my subjects than to be told what I need to read in order to get a piece of paper.
Absolutely.
I just noticed our time. We are out of it. And you want to let people know where they can find you and your books and everything else.
Sure. You can always find me over at brianjjones.com. Spell out J, Brian, JAYJones.com. You can also find me running my mouth under that name over at what's left of Twitter, I think. And I've moved over to Blue Sky for the most part. Blue Sky for the most part there as well. I'm on Threads, but I don't post there as much yet. I'm still figuring that one out.
So I've heard. I'm looking into it and wondering, do I really want to get involved? And yeah, maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, Twitter used to be really fun, but it's not. It's very different now.
Well, people can find this show on YouTube and TalkStream Live and Rumble, and of course on Blog Talk, and on about 20 or 30 other servers. So we will be out there on the airwaves for a very long time, and hopefully even longer than it takes you to write a book. But I will get a hold of you, and we will book you in for next spring, April, May, in there someplace for the George Lucas book.
I will look forward to it. That'd be great.
Oh, it'll be fun. So thank you so much for spending your time with us and for getting more deeply into the material about Dr. Seuss. And I highly recommend the book. I also recommend the Jim Henson book because I enjoyed thoroughly reading both of them, and I'm looking forward to George Lucas. So good night, everybody. Thank you for being here, and thanks again, Brian. Good night.
Thanks, Barbara. Good night.